Thank you very much. Thank you. I stand before you as a great fan of the IB and a great fan of this school, which is one of the earliest, as you heard, to introduce the IB in the UK, indeed perhaps in the world. And this couldn't be a more significant time for the IB. If you think about the fact that the 21st century that now opens itself before us is going to be a theatre of even greater change and more rapid change than we've seen in the last quarter of a century or half a century, you realise that the prospects that lie before people who are now in education are that they're going to be asked to do things, to take on careers, to take on invitations and challenges in their lives that we can't even imagine now. And most of the people who are now in education will probably live until they're well past 100. That's the good news. Bad news is that they probably won't be able to retire until they're about 80 or 90. That means they've got a long series of careers ahead of them, and they therefore need to know what they can take with them into that future. And the one waterproof thing, the one time-proof guaranteed thing that they can carry with them into a very diverse and as yet unclear future is the ability to keep learning, the ability to think, to evaluate, to assess evidence, to reason sharply and clearly, to examine assumptions, and therefore always to be equipped to master new techniques, new technologies, new ideas, and to make a success of their lives and to make a contribution to their societies. And so the kind of education that an IB education consists in is very much tailored to producing individuals of that kind, people with that kind of mind, that kind of intellect and outlook. And I think more schools should take on the IB. I notice with pleasure that those schools who continue to teach A-level are learning some of the lessons from IB by trying to enrich and broaden the curriculum even in the sixth form, where, alas, too often the approach is over-directed on examinations and curricula tend to be a little narrow. So in those schools you see people adding on, bringing back the kinds of extra studies that were once possible before the curriculum became too exigent. But in a situation where people are studying the IB, the basis, the platform for developing the kind of intellect suited to our century and its times, well, it lies there. And one part of this, as you've just heard, is the philosophical cast of mind. Now, it happens that everybody is philosophical. And in philosophy, you know, with a capital F, sounds a bit alarming, and people think it's an enterprise which involves a lot of very long words in very difficult texts, long words like marmalade and corrugated iron and so on, and that this jargon has to be mastered in order to be able to get some access to philosophical debates. The thing is that if you go to a library or a bookshop and you take down one or other of the classics of philosophy, as it might be Plato or Descartes or David Hume, you will find philosophy a much more accessible, a much more inviting and exciting enterprise than one would give it credit for. There are only two periods in the history of philosophy where philosophy became so abstruse and so technical, so laden with jargon that people who hadn't had a long training it couldn't understand. And that was in the medieval period among the scholastic philosophers as they're known, and alas in our own day where philosophy has again become a rather specialized pursuit. But the truth is that it belongs to everybody. Everybody has open to them an invitation to be involved in the great conversation of thought that has marked the development of our civilizations, thinking about what knowledge is and how we get it, thinking about the nature of the good and worthwhile life, thinking about the contrast between right and wrong, thinking about the nature of reason and of good reasoning, thinking about exploring, unearthing and investigating the assumptions by which we all live. Because of course, as you know, none of us see the world as it is exactly as it is in itself. But we look at the world and at other people through a pair of spectacles, in some cases double glazed, as in my own case, but through a set of spectacles which consists of concepts, of a framework of interpretation that makes the world and other people seem a certain way to us. And it's of the greatest importance to take off those spectacles from time to time and to look at them and to see how they shape and color and maybe sometimes distort the way the world appears to us through those lenses. That's the examination of assumptions, the critical examination of them. And it's tremendously important that we should do it. And I love to cite the example of just how surprising sometimes it can be when one discovers what certain assumptions are. You heard there that I have an association with Oxford. I was a student there and I taught there for a long time. And you've all heard of Oxford. And some of you may have heard of that other place in the damp meadows of eastern England. I think it's called Cambridge, and you will have noticed that Oxford people have this rather sceptical view about Cambridge, which is that Cambridge people appear to think that anything that happens in or near Cambridge applies to the entire universe. And I give you an example, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was sitting in a damp meadow near Cambridge one day when an apple fell from a tree. It's rather a romantic story, this one, because the apple was attracted to the earth and the earth to the apple. So I imagine there were violins playing in the background. So these two bodies were mutually attracted to one another. And as Newton pondered on the phenomenon of the apple falling to the ground, he noticed the moon in the sky. It was daytime, but as you know, the moon quite often visible in the daytime. And he wondered to himself why the moon doesn't fall to the earth. And as a result of his reflections on this conundrum, came up with the idea of gravity, the force of gravity, the inverse square law, which explains the interaction of bodies having mass. And like a good Cambridge man, since gravity worked near Cambridge, he naturally applied it to the whole universe. So now, if you were a sharply trained, forensically skilled Sevenoaks student, you would want to ask him why he thought that the universe takes the same laws as apply in Cambridge. You would say to him, why do you think that these laws work everywhere? And he would say, because he does say, well, the laws apply everywhere because the universe is the same everywhere. He uses a wonderful poetic phrase. He says the universe is homogeneous throughout its parts. But you haven't been trained here for nothing, and in particular, you're IB students, so you press your advantage. You say to him, but why do you think that? Why do you think the universe is the same everywhere? And he would say, because he does say in his writings, the universe is the same everywhere because it was created by God, and God is an economical workman. Now, there are three assumptions there: that there is a God, that she created the universe, and that she's an economical workman. Three assumptions. What the validity of those assumptions might be in themselves is a matter for another discussion at another time. But the fact that those assumptions lie in the very foundations of modern Newtonian classical physics should be surprising. They're not physical assumptions. They're not motivated by empirical or physical considerations. They are ad hoc assumptions required for a view like the one that Newton built in the Principia. But they're not scientific assumptions, and it's very, very surprising that theological ideas should be part of the very fabric of classical physics in that way. So you can see how surprising it sometimes is when you dig down, you explore into the substructure of frameworks of ideas to see why we think as we do. And we can get some very surprising results. In fact, the truth is that there are much more surprising results even than that one. So thinking philosophically, examining ideas, looking at the evidence and the reasons that people can offer for thinking as they do, looking at the way that frameworks of ideas hang together, inspecting those lenses through which we see the world around us, those are very, very important tasks. And a reflective, mature society and a reflective, mature individual needs to undertake that kind of activity on a pretty frequent basis. You'll remember what Bertrand Russell said. He said, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. And this is a reminder of just how significant it is that from time to time we should apply some thought to our thinking. And this, of course, is most important when we consider the question asked by Socrates, the invitation issued by Socrates, to reflect on our lives and the values by which we live and the sorts of goals that we think are worth moving towards. Socrates went round asking his fellow Athenians, what sort of people do you think we should be? By what by what system of values should we live? What do we mean by the concepts that we use when we think about good and worthwhile lives? And he provoked them into thinking about these things, quite often by demonstrating to them they didn't know really what they were talking about when they used these conventional terms. You would have been reading in the bath last night Plato's dialogue, the Meno. So you will be well aware of that little episode in which this rich young man called Meno comes to Athens on business. In those days, there wasn't a lot of telly or bingo around in the evening, so he went, as people did, to hear Socrates lecture. And he wanted to ask Socrates a really important question. And the really important question was, is virtue teachable? Can the upstanding citizens of Thebes and Corinth and Athens, can they pass on their sense of virtue to their children? After all, their children, their teenagers were drinking too much ouzo and staying up late at night and stealing chariots and doing wheelies around the city walls and generally being a nuisance in the way that teenagers no longer are. And so he wanted to know whether it would be possible for these upstanding citizens to pass on their sense of virtue to their children. And Socrates said, I don't know. And Meno was really surprised. What? You, the great Socrates, you don't know if virtue is teachable? How can that be? Socrates said, because I don't know the answer to a more fundamental question, which is what virtue is. And Meno his ghast was flabbered. He said, Socrates, you're meant to be our greatest philosopher. How can you not know what virtue is? Socrates said, do you know? And Meno said, of course I do. Socrates said, thank God. I've been looking for somebody all my life who knows what virtue is. And you can imagine what happened next, because every definition that Meno offered him, Socrates demolished. Until eventually Meno said, oh, you're like a wasp, you stung my lips and tongue. I don't know what to say. Socrates said, good, now that you know that you don't know what you're talking about, we can begin to make progress. This is a wonderful little episode, really, because it illustrates that confusion is the beginning of wisdom. So if ever you feel confused about anything, you know you're on the right road. So this is the example of the challenge to the way we think, challenge to conventional ideas and concepts. And this challenge is the process of philosophy, of trying to think things through. And central to this is a refusal to be over-prepared, too ready to accept what people say, to accept conventional attitudes, to accept beliefs that have been handed down from the past, to accept the authority of previous generations or elders in one society or institutions in society which exist to tell people what to think. I suppose that the first prompt really to a skeptical attitude, to being thoughtful about what people expect us to think and believe and how we're expected to behave, might come from realizing something a bit like this. Some of you here will remember Mrs. Mary Whitehouse. Remember Mrs. Whitehouse? The only human being on planet Earth who had a television set with no off button. So she used to have to watch everything, including all the nude scenes after 9 o'clock at night, and they would upset her. And she would write letters to the BBC saying, I don't like it, therefore nobody else is allowed to watch it. This is the typical attitude of the moralist. I don't agree, so you're not allowed. I think this is bad, so nobody else is allowed to do such and such. Now, somebody might want to say to her, on what grounds are you trying to impose your view on us? On what grounds do you just automatically expect that the conventional attitude you have on this matter, which is a matter of morality, why should everybody accept it? Give me your reasons. Give me the evidence that you have. Let me examine it. Let me sift through and see whether I agree. Now, I imagine that a long time ago, perhaps 2,500, 3,000 years ago, in the very crucible of our civilization in classical antiquity, this is what began to happen. Socrates himself is a perfect example of this, of being skeptical, of wanting to know what the reasons are, what the evidence is for thinking one way rather than another. And it has become a central feature of the philosophical quest, the attempt to understand the skeptical challenges that can be made to our best endeavors to know and to understand ourselves, our world, and other people in it. And I'd like, if I may, just to describe something of this great project, because it's not only an important one in philosophy, but through philosophy, in education, and through education, of course, in life itself. So let me tell you this. And this, of course, is something else that you were reading in the bath last night, so you will be familiar with it. And this is Plato's other great dialogue, the Theaetetus. In that dialogue, Plato gets his mouthpiece, Socrates, to debate with his interlocutors the question of what knowledge is. What is knowledge? And in that dialogue, we get the rudiments, the beginning of a conversation about the nature of knowledge, which has existed right the way through our tradition. And the rudiments are that if you wanted to analyze what we mean when we talk about knowledge, you would find that you meant that you can say of somebody that that person knows something if that person believes it and the belief is true, but also that the person's reason for believing it is justified. They have a justification for it. This is known now in the jargon as the justified true belief model of knowledge. And anybody who studies a little bit of theory of knowledge in philosophy, or does it at the IB, will know that there is a set of problems about this, but the most pressing problem concerns that condition which requires of us that we justify our belief in this proposition. So in the justified true belief model, justification is the problematic, the first, perhaps most problematic aspect of trying to understand what we are doing when we say we know something. And this debate has been of great significance, especially in the modern epistemological discussion in the 20th century and 21st century, and it continues today. But one thing it does is it invites us to consider how justification can go wrong. I mean, supposing, for example, you say, well, I believe that there is a laptop sitting on the lectern in front of me here, and you say, how do you know that there is? And I say, well, I can see it, I can touch it. If I nibble it, I get a sort of laptop-y taste. If I bang on it, I can hear it. So I can use my five senses of seeing and smelling and tasting and hearing and touching, and through them I can detect the presence of the object. And then you can say to me, well, what happens if you're actually not standing in front of a laptop on a lectern, but you're really in bed asleep and dreaming, or perhaps having a nightmare to the effect that you're giving a lecture on philosophy? You all know the story, don't you, about the member of the House of Lords who dreamt he was giving a speech in the House of Lords, woke up and found that he was. So there'd be some. So you might challenge me and you say, well, perhaps you're dreaming that you can see and hear and feel a laptop. If you're going to be able to claim to know that there is a laptop in front of you, you must be able to exclude the possibility that you're now dreaming. How can you exclude the possibility? Well, you might think this is a bit outre, this is a bit of an artificial example, really. So the skeptic might say to you, well, okay, let me give you a different consideration, which is this. You say you see the laptop or you feel it. Now only consider what that involves. It involves a very elaborate causal chain. Circumambient light falls on the object, reflects from its surface, propagates through the intervening medium, falls on the lens of the eye, again, double glazed in some cases, is focused by the lens of the eye onto the retina, irritates the rods and cones in the retina, which sets off an impulse along the optic nerves, which, as you know, cross in the brain at the chiasm, back to the occipital regions of the cerebral cortices at the back of your head, where cells in your brain fire. So at the very end of this long sequence, causal sequence of events, you have some brain activity going on in the back of your head. And that is what it is to see. The technicolor phenomenology of consciousness, of visual consciousness, is actually a set of activities in the back of your brain. Similarly, if I touch, the dendrites at the end of the axons, my fingertips, are stimulated. This sends an impulse along the axon. You may know, if you've studied a bit of the physiology of the nervous system, that nerves have a myelinic sheath, a sort of fatty sheath on it to speed up the impulses. They jump from gap to gap in the myelinic sheath by changing the polarity of the sodium and potassium ions in the wall of the axon. They shoot along the axon like that. And when they get to a synapse, they have to stop, get into a little boat, row across to the synapse, go to the other side, another little boat, on the other side, another axon, get up to the spine. If you've touched something hot, there'll be another message that goes back to your muscle, tell you, pull your finger away, and then another message to go to your brain to tell you you've been burned. It's all very elaborate. And yet, that sense of touch also, like the visual experience, ends up in your brain, it stimulates some nerve cells, and it's up there in your skull that you have the feeling of touch, not in your fingertip. In fact, when you consider how we perceive, how our sensory modalities work, you realize this, that it is as if we wear a helmet, like a motorbike helmet, except it doesn't have a visor in the front. You can't see out of it. You've got this closed helmet on, it's your skull, and on the top of it you've got a camera and a microphone, which is getting information and beaming the information inside the helmet. And inside the helmet you're getting these data, these bits of information, from which you are inferring that a world outside your helmet is enough like what you've got inside the helmet for you to be able to form some beliefs about it. And as you reflect on this process, you realize that the camera and the microphone picking up this data from outside the helmet are actually interfering with the data. You know that the world in itself is colorless, tasteless, silent, that sounds and textures and colors are something contributed by our sensory experience. We interpret the way the light, the frequency of the light as it falls on our retina and stimulates our optic nerves, gives a color to the things that we see. It's easily proved. Only think of people who are colorblind. They don't see the world as having quite the same colors as people who are not colorblind. So it shows you that how things seem to be colored is the result of activity up here, not out there in the world. You've all heard that thing, haven't you, about if the tree falls in the forest and there's no sentient beings by, no ears by, does it make a sound? The answer is no. Of course, when it falls, it compresses the airwaves, and so if there were an eardrum to be vibrated by the air, then there might be a sound. You need an eardrum, an aural nerve, a brain. But if there's no eardrum and brain, there's no sound. The world is silent until it's heard. This is a version, by the way, of the more important philosophical point. If a man says something in the forest and there's no woman there to hear him, is he still wrong? So that's a version of that argument. So you can see that sounds, colors, textures, tastes, so these properties of things are not in the objects themselves, but are an interpretation that we place on them. We color things. We give them their sense and tastes by the way that our sensory organs work. So we know that the camera and the microphone and the other sensors on our helmet are feeding in information about the external world, but they're adding something to it. And you can't take the helmet off to see whether the world out there is anything like the picture of the world inside the helmet. So how do you know that there's a world out there at all? Couldn't it be, as when you dream, as when you've been out a bit late at night to a party, and the world seems rather strangely different? Couldn't it be that the reason why the world seems as it does has more to do with you or some intervening part of the causal mechanism and not the world itself? How do you know what you think you know about the world? So says the skeptic. So he didn't have to appeal to dreams or delusions. He could just point out to you what we think about perception. And perception itself seems very problematic. Is it really a reliable source of information? What about this? Sometimes we make mistakes. You're walking in the park at dusk. You see what you think is the professor of philosophy from the local university. It turns out to be a bush or a dog. Well, sometimes we just make mistakes. You're working out your overdraft. You find to your great relief that actually you're not in the red, you're in the black, until your bank manager rings you up and tells you that you've added up incorrectly. We make mistakes. How do we know on any one occasion that we're not in error when we make a judgment or when we reason? How can you exclude the possibility that you're not misled by the sensors on your helmet? How can you be sure 100% that you're not now dreaming? That's what the skeptic asks us. Now, some skeptics are interested in trying to establish something, trying to prove to us that actually we don't know very much about the world, or about the past, or about outer space, or about human psychology. Such skeptics are known as problematic skeptics because they offer us skeptical challenges as a problem. They want to try to convince us that there are certain areas of our inquiries where we can't do better than have beliefs, more or less supported by the evidence or by our reason, but that we can never really know in that area of inquiry. This harks back to something that happened in ancient times. In fact, after Plato's own day, you know, Plato founded a university, the Academy, and quite soon after his death, the Academy became taken over by a group of skeptical philosophers who, because there'd been great debate about the nature of the world and the nature of moral good, and because the arguments seemed inconclusive, because it seemed to them that the arguments for a particular point of view were as good or bad as arguments against that point of view, perhaps we can never know. They split into two camps, these skeptics. The Pyrrhonian skeptics, who followed a man called Pyrrho of Elis, said, we are never going to be able to know, so we must suspend judgment. We must just not try to arrive at any conclusions. The academic skeptics, that's the ones in Plato's Academy, said, well, we agree with you that we're never going to be able to know, but we have to act. Here we are in the world, we've got responsibilities to our societies, our families, so we've got to go by our best lights. So even though we can't really have knowledge, we've got to try anyway to justify the things that we believe. And so they were a bit more moderate in their skepticism. But the Pyrrhonian skeptics and the academic skeptics represented the fact that after some centuries of trying to think about the nature of the world and trying to think about human society, that Greek philosophy had reached a point of what used to be called elenchus, that is, of doubt or suspension in a way of the activity of inquiry. And some centuries later, a writer called Sextus Empiricus collected together all the arguments that the Pyrrhonians and the academic skeptics had put forward, showing, sometimes spuriously, sometimes rather powerfully,